Is this your reign, you wretch? Is this how you have governed the empire? The question was spat from the mouth of Heraclius, the man who had just overthrown the most hated ruler in Constantinople. Before him stood the deposed Emperor Phocas, stripped of his imperial robes and his dignity. The answer hardly mattered. Within moments, Phocas's right hand was chopped off, then his head. His corpse was dragged through the heart of the city, a city that had cheered his coronation just 8 years earlier, before being burned to ash. How does an emperor fall so far, so fast? How does a man who seizes a throne in a wave of popular support inspire such visceral hatred that his own death becomes a public bloodsport? This is the story of Phocas, the tyrant emperor of Byzantium. His brutal reign of paranoia and terror left the Roman Empire on its knees, and his own gruesome end was a dark reflection of the violence he'd brought to the throne. One Byzantine historian would later write that even speaking of his suffering is itself suffering. That's the scar Phocas left on the memory of the empire. So how does a man like Phocas even happen? To get that, you have to understand the world that made him. At the turn of the 7th century, the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire in the East, was a state under crushing pressure. Its ruler was Emperor Maurice, a tough old general who had been on the throne for 20 years. Maurice had inherited an empire fighting wars on multiple fronts with a treasury that was bone dry. He was a man defined by discipline and, above all, austerity. He managed to end a long, grueling war with the Sasanian Persian Empire, not with armies, but with a brilliant stroke of diplomacy. When the Persian Shah, Khosrow II, was overthrown, Maurice helped him reclaim his throne. In return, Byzantium got a peace treaty that finally secured its eastern frontier. With the east quiet, Maurice turned his attention to the Balkans, where nomadic Avars and migrating Slavs were constantly raiding across the Danube River. Maurice's campaigns were slow, methodical, and mostly successful, pushing the invaders back and re-establishing Roman control. But all these successes came at a cost, and Maurice's methods bred resentment. He was famously tight-fisted. It was probably necessary for a bankrupt state, but it made him deeply unpopular. He slashed army pay, which led to mutinies. In one notorious incident, he refused to pay a ransom for 12,000 Roman soldiers captured by the Avars. The prisoners were executed, and in the eyes of the army, the blame fell squarely on the emperor. The breaking point finally came in the autumn of 602. After a long, hard season of fighting, Maurice ordered his exhausted and underpaid Balkan army to do the unthinkable: set up winter quarters on the far side of the Danube in hostile, barren territory and live off the land. For the soldiers, this was the last straw. They were tired, far from home, and felt abandoned by an emperor who seemed to value his budget more than their lives. The seeds of rebellion, planted long ago, were ready to sprout in the cold mud of the Danube. All the army needed was a leader to give voice to their rage. They found him in a centurion, a middle-ranking officer of common stock named Phocas. Phocas wasn't some high-born noble with a fancy education. He was a coarse, provincial career soldier who had worked his way up through the ranks. But he had a raw charisma and understood the grievances of his men because they were his grievances. He'd even been part of an earlier delegation sent to Constantinople to protest pay cuts, where he was reportedly insulted by court officials. That experience just hardened his resentment. When Maurice's order to winter across the Danube came down, simmering discontent exploded into open mutiny. The soldiers flat out refused. They raised Phocas on a shield, the traditional way of declaring a new emperor, and turned their march away from the frontier and toward the heart of the empire, Constantinople. As Phocas and his rebel army advanced, the news spread like wildfire, revealing just how fragile Maurice's regime was. Back in Constantinople, the emperor had grown distant. The city was split by powerful factions, the Blues and the Greens. These were more than just chariot racing fan clubs. They were powerful political networks. When Maurice tried to rally them to defend the capital, he was met with jeers and hostility. The city that once hailed him as a hero now turned on him. the government collapsed with shocking speed. As Phocas reached the capital, the city gates were thrown open. Maurice, the veteran emperor, was completely abandoned. He and his family fled the great palace in a small boat, hoping to reach the east and rally loyal troops. But it was too late. A simple centurion just weeks before was now being hailed as the new emperor of the Romans. On November 23, 602, Phocas was crowned. The people celebrated, thinking a better era had dawned. They had no idea what was coming. One of the new emperor's first jobs was to secure his throne, and that meant getting rid of the old emperor. Maurice and his family were captured before they could get away. What happened next was an act of calculated brutality that would stain Phocas's name forever. Phocas had Maurice brought to the harbor of Chalcedon. There, the deposed emperor was forced to watch as, one by one, his 6 sons were executed right in front of him. The historian Theophylact Simocatta records that through his grief, Maurice just kept repeating, "You are just, O Lord, and your judgment is right." After his last son was killed, Maurice himself was beheaded. This wasn't just an execution, it was a massacre. Usurping the throne was shocking enough, but the systematic slaughter of the entire imperial family was a new level of savagery. Phocas wanted to make sure there were no heirs left to challenge him. Their bodies were thrown into the sea. Phocas's reign was born in blood, and it set the precedent for the next 8 years. Initially, Phocas spared Maurice's wife, the Empress Constantina, and her daughters, sending them to a monastery. It was a tiny sliver of mercy in an ocean of bloodshed. But even that wouldn't last. A tyrant's fear is a bottomless pit, and soon it would consume them too. When you seize a throne through violence, you tend to see enemies everywhere. Phocas was a usurper from a humble background, and he deeply distrusted the sophisticated elites of Constantinople, who he knew saw him as a crude, provincial upstart. His insecurity fueled a paranoia that spiraled out of control, and his answer to any threat, real or imagined, was always the same: ruthless, overwhelming force. His reign became a horror story of purges, conspiracies, and executions. The atmosphere in the capital grew thick with fear. Spies and informers were everywhere. Anyone with a link to the old regime was a potential target. Nobles, generals, and administrators were arrested, tortured, and executed on the flimsiest of charges. This paranoia soon turned on the very family he'd promised to spare. Around 605, hearing rumors of a plot involving the former Empress Constantina, Phocas had her and her daughters dragged from the monastery and executed. Any pretense of mercy was long gone. One of the most infamous examples of Phocas's cruelty was what he did to the general Narses, the commander of the eastern armies. Narses had rebelled when Phocas took power and held out for a time in the city of Edessa. Unable to beat him in the field, Phocas resorted to treachery. He sent a promise of safe conduct, swearing a holy oath that no harm would come to Narses if he came to negotiate. Trusting the emperor's sacred oath, the general accepted. As soon as he arrived in the capital, Phocas had him seized and burned alive. This act wasn't just cruel, it was politically catastrophic. It showed the world that the emperor's word meant nothing. It alienated the army, terrified the aristocracy, and proved to all his enemies that he was a ruler governed by nothing but his own brutal impulses. His tyranny also spilled over into religion, as he launched persecutions against Jews and other Christian groups, which only stirred up more hatred in the eastern provinces. Phocas wasn't building a secure regime, he was hollowing out the empire from the inside, destroying the very trust it was built on. While Phocas was terrorizing Constantinople, a storm was gathering on the eastern frontier. The Persian Shah, Khosrau II, owed his throne to the murdered Emperor Maurice. Maurice had been his ally, his protector, almost a father to him. The news of his brutal murder gave Khosrau the perfect excuse, a casus belli, to launch the war of conquest he'd likely always wanted. He saw an empire destabilized by a brutal and incompetent usurper, and he took his chance. In 603, the Sasanian Persian army launched a massive invasion. The Byzantine defenses in the east, which Maurice had so carefully managed, started to crumble. Phocas's purges had done their work. Experienced generals were either dead or too terrified to act. The betrayal and murder of Narses had removed one of the empire's best commanders. The Persian advance was relentless. The key fortress of Dara fell in 604. Then Mesopotamia and Armenia were overrun. By 608, Persian armies were raiding deep into Anatolia, reaching Chalcedon right across the water from Constantinople itself. The empire that had been stable just a few years before was now fighting for its life. Phocas was a disaster as a military leader. He had to pull troops from the collapsing Persian front just to deal with the constant revolts popping up all over the empire. The state was bleeding from 1,000 cuts, and the tyrant on the throne was the one holding the knife. His bloody rise to power hadn't just destabilized the empire, it had invited its destruction. As the Persians tore through the east and Phocas's tyranny bled the capital dry, a new hope was rising from the most secure part of the empire, the Exarchate of Africa. Its ruler was Heraclius the Elder, a respected general who had served faithfully under Maurice. From afar, he watched in horror as the empire his friend had built was dismantled by a bloodthirsty tyrant. In 608, a plea for help arrived in Carthage. The conspiracy against Phocas now included his own son-in-law, who secretly urged Heraclius to act. The decision was made. Heraclius the Elder and his son, also named Heraclius, began their rebellion. Their plan was brilliant. First, they cut off the grain supply from Africa to Constantinople, putting immediate pressure on Phocas, who needed that grain to feed the capital. Next, they launched a two-pronged attack. Heraclius's cousin, Nicetas, led an army overland to invade and secure Egypt, the empire's other great breadbasket. At the same time, Heraclius the Younger, a bold and charismatic commander, set sail with a powerful fleet, with the capital itself as his target. The revolt gained momentum with incredible speed. As Heraclius's fleet sailed east, cities and provinces declared their allegiance to him. The deep, widespread hatred for Phocas was now on full display. He had no real allies, only subjects kept in line by fear, and as a new power rose, that fear simply vanished. Phocas was utterly alone. The man who had taken the throne at the head of a popular revolt was now about to be overthrown by one. The empire's savior was coming, and the tyrant's time was almost up. On October 3, 610, the fleet of Heraclius appeared on the horizon of Constantinople. The sight of the rebel ships sent the city into a frenzy. Phocas's regime, built on pure terror, shattered in an instant. The people rose up. Even the elite guards deserted him. Phocas was captured, not fighting for his throne, but found hiding somewhere, stripped of all dignity. He was dragged from the palace, thrown into a small boat, and brought before Heraclius. The confrontation was short and brutal. Heraclius, looking at the defeated tyrant, sneered, "Is this how you have ruled, wretch?" With a final defiant gasp of cynicism, Phocas reportedly shot back, "And will you rule better?" That insolent reply may have sealed his fate. The execution was not quick. It was a savage public spectacle designed to satisfy the city's bottomless hatred. Heraclius himself may have delivered the first blow. Phocas's right arm was hacked off, then his head. His body was further mutilated, with some accounts saying it was revenge for his specific crimes against the powerful families of the city. His severed head was placed on a pike and paraded through the main street of Constantinople. The mangled remains of his corpse were dragged through the city to the Forum of the Ox and publicly burned. The man who began his reign with the butchery of an emperor was now the butchered tyrant. The same crowds that had cheered his coronation 8 years earlier now cheered the desecration of his body. On October 5, 610, Heraclius was crowned the new emperor. Phocas's reign is remembered as an absolute, unmitigated disaster. He inherited an empire that, while strained, was stable. he left his successor a state in total chaos. Heraclius took the throne to find an empty treasury, the Balkans once again overrun, and the Sasanian Persians in control of Syria and Palestine and pushing deep into Anatolia. The devastating war Phocas had provoked would rage for nearly 2 more decades, leaving both the Byzantine and Sasanian empires so exhausted that they were unable to resist the sudden, explosive rise of a new power from the Arabian desert: Islam. Later historians, writing under the dynasty Heraclius founded, had every reason to paint Phocas as a monster to justify their founder's own coup. And yet, the evidence of his brutality is overwhelming. His paranoia destroyed the army, his cruelty alienated the people, and his incompetence shattered the state. He was a tyrant whose power came not from strength, but from a profound and fatal weakness. It leaves you wondering, was Phocas a uniquely evil man who single-handedly brought the empire to its knees? Or was he just a symptom of a sickness already in the empire? A brutal man for brutal times, whose own horrifying end was simply the mirror image of the violence he'd unleashed on the world? The tyrant was dead, but the ghosts of his reign would haunt Byzantium for centuries. If you want to explore more of the turbulent history of the Byzantine Empire, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Ancient Vault for more stories of emperors, battles, and intrigue. Your support helps us bring these incredible historical narratives to light. Let us know in the comments which Byzantine emperor you'd like us to cover next. Thanks for watching.